the pie into equal slicehood would shrink the size of the pie. The fact poses by nature, which was taught in my introductory economics classes, a trade-off between income equality and income efficiency. Inefficiencies by nature, if you try to address them through redistribution, is like a leaky bucket. Created to move income from the rich to the poor, basically leaks, including the loss of administrative costs, and more importantly, the loss of incentives. You know, because by nature, it's your hard work that's simply giving your payment, nothing else. And so it's a misdirection with efficiency implications. And then Robert Borrell, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, right, at the University of Chicago School, stated the following: of the tendencies that are harmful to sound economics, the most seductive, in my opinion, and the most poisonous is to focus on the questions of distribution. This is from a Nobel Prize-winning economist. Okay, so you basically then have, Barrow's quote, and in some sense, it doesn't mean that all the neoclassicals are that way. I mean, arguably, people like Jeffrey Sachs, so people always say, you like Jeffrey Sachs? I've met him a few times. They said, what's Jeffrey Sachs? Mr. Shock Therapy or Mr. Save the World with Millennium Development Goals? Okay, I don't know. So in any case, he started talking about inequality. Inequality causes, it's a disease. It cripples those who are economically socially disadvantaged from participating more fully in life processes. And so, they basically says, Sachs argues, it's hard to see how society sharply divided between rich and poor could give close to even rudimentary efficiency, much less a high standard of raising every child to its potential. Unequal societies tend to places of low social trust, unstable politics, and corruption, obviously, right? But he's still neoclassical. How do you address this? Educate people. So we're back to human capital. Simply raise your education. That was to some hinted at the talk this morning by Dr. Fred. Inequality will improve, basically, with job market skills. And we're simply back to the marginal productivity theory. And so the question now becomes, how do we understand the model of the relationship between maldistribution of wealth and power and how it accumulates? And I'm going to pass the mic back to my colleague here.
Thanks, Howard. We are indeed a dynamic duo. Cool. Yeah, after having reviewed the orthodox perspective, let's say a few words about the heterodox perspective. We already introduced the idea of cumulative advantage as a major idea, and the classic representation in economics is the idea of differential saving rates or differential rates of return. So you would say you have some saving rate S, and if the saving rate out of profit income is greater than that of wage income, or if the saving rate of the rich is greater than that of the poor, you have a dynamic which creates a drift between these groups, and they will grow further apart over time. Similar things could be said about rates of return. If the rates of return for those who with profit income, or if the rates of return for the richer groups are higher, then you will again see such a drift where rich and poor polarize, and the differentiation becomes greater. And this is exactly a classic representation of cumulative advantage, so basically saying that rates of return or saving rates differ with respect conditional on your position in the distribution, and this is also something that we find in the data. And if we have such assumptions, we will always amplify existing inequalities. So once we have some different in asset holdings, cumulative advantage kicks in, and if we have no dampening factors, then we have polarization. So from a heterodox perspective, we need some checks and balances, because otherwise this will explode. And of course, both arguments reflect power differentials. So the saving rate represents the idea that those with higher income have the ability or possibility to save more, and the second idea would be that because of their better social relations and of the greater amount of capital they invest, richer households will also get a higher rate of return. And this is what we see also in the data. So if we look in a rudimentary level, for example, on the average annual wealth growth rate, this is what this chart is showing, and it's again for the global population and going from the very poor to the very rich. And here you see basically that we have some heterogeneity across the line, but at the very top we have these increasing growth rates which basically represent what we have on a stylized level on the left side. So as already mentioned, we can also frame this cumulative advantage as a Matthew effect. The Matthew effect is a well-known concept across the sciences, and it was, so to say, first used by Robert K. Merton, the classic sociologist, in his paper, The Matthew Effect in Science. What he means by the Matthew effect is exactly this kind of self-reinforcing positive feedback effect. However, he did not do the analysis for wealth, he did the analysis for scientific recognition. The Matthew effect consists in the accruing of greater increments of recognition for particular scientific contributions and the withholding of such recognitions from scientists who have not yet made their mark. So there's a very interesting gender-specific aspect to this paper of Merton, because he co-authored a study with a colleague. I think she was called Zuckerman, and the colleague was a woman, and she was also the first author, so it was Zuckerman and Merton. And he very often saw this study cited as Merton and Zuckerman. And then he asked his colleagues, why did you cite our study in the wrong order? And they said, I have not thought about it, I just did it, because the name Merton is so much more prominent. People regularly put it first, even if he is the second author. And so, different topic, but a similar core idea. Growth rates in wealth or in recognition, as in Merton's example, depend on existing stock. And there's a positive feedback for those who are already powerful, rich, visible, and widely read. Okay, and this, an interesting thing also for interdisciplinary communication is simply that what we would maybe call as economists cumulative advantage, many sociologists would call Matthew effect. Here is another version of this idea of cumulative advantage, and here we have a quote that can be related to inequality, but is very often or is originally intended to describe development dynamics. It's by Nicholas Caldo, and he says, success breeds further success and failure begets more failure, which leads to a polarization process which inhibits the growth of manufacturing activities in some areas and concentrates them in others. Again, we have this idea of a self-reinforcing positive feedback effect that can be used to better understand the accumulation of wealth, but that also has an important implication for understanding persistent stratification in the global economy. So I think this is important to see these parallels also between those principles that govern wealth dynamics and those that govern development. So we can summarize this part of the talk. We have heard basic perspectives. How do heterodox and orthodox perspective rationalize the existence of these power laws in distribution, and what should hence be done? And we saw that from a heterodox perspective, we would always expect an endogenous increase in inequality by means of cumulative advantage, and hence we need some checks and balances to stop or dampen this endogenous process of concentration, whereas in orthodox economics we would largely say that inequality is meritocratic, it reflects productivity, and we should hence employ no checks and balances. Rather, there is the danger that these checks and balances then would distort incentives and, so to say, reduce the size of the pie overall. As markets and free competition in markets are considered to be a key driver for inequalities, it makes also sense to plot out or to lay out that, so to say, this different estimate on the nature of checks and balances needed also applies to market regulation. We would say in heterodox economics, markets are generally also subject to endogenous tendencies of concentration, leading to power asymmetries, which are then entangled with the power asymmetries we find in the wealth distribution. Hence, we also need checks and balances for markets because they feed in on this inequality dynamics. And again, from an orthodox perspective, we would rather say, okay, markets in general get things right, and they also, because of the competition principle, will lead to a diffusion of power, not a concentration, and hence we do not need checks and balances for markets, maybe in some special cases. So Okay, so we have a very clear-cut picture where we have different principles that are used to explain this pattern and also different conclusions for policy coming out of this. By this, we then move to the final part of this talk, giving two applied perspectives. I will speak a little bit about the statistical estimation of wealth inequality, and then Howard has a more extensive part on how all this maps onto Africa, onto the history of Africa. So let's speak a little bit about the statistical estimation of wealth inequality. Why should we be concerned with that? I think the simple reason is that it is empowering and it can give us a better grip on handling this data, and it can give us a better grip on checking whether data that we have is reliable, and I will also show some means that you can use in case you have missing data or data that lacks reliability. My students know this slide. It's a little bit a crazy slide because it has many equations. You cannot yet see them. But the big advantage of this slide is that it explains all you need to know about the mathematics to get started. Okay, so it's really a one-slide primer on everything. The idea is as follows. A power law is generally defined as a function where the argument has an exponent. So the example is we have an argument x and it has an exponent alpha. And now we can use such a function to describe the relation between the ranks of the individuals, so the richest, the second richest, the third richest, and the wealth these people hold. And for doing so, we go back to Pareto, and Pareto said the number of people with wealth greater than some value x is proportional to 1 over x to the power of alpha. Okay, so we can give a functional expression for the rank of some household just knowing his or her wealth and knowing the alpha, which describes the shape of the distribution, basically telling us how unequal is this. Is it very or very, very unequal? So we have this expression here, which we basically take from Pareto, and the first thing that we can see is that if we reformulate that a little, we can arrive at an expression telling us which wealth to expect at what rank. So if you have information about the wealth of the richest, the second richest, and the third richest, you maybe can infer now the wealth of the fourth richest guy with a little bit of luck. We have a means to calculate expected wealth by knowing the rank of some person. This is one nice thing. Then a second feature comes in. We would typically say that this power law distribution pattern is not suitable to describe the whole distribution, but just the upper segment. Okay? So the part that interests us will start with some minimal wealth, x min. And if we then use an expression for the rank Ni and an expression for the final rank considered to be Pareto distributed, which is NR, we can go further from that. When we can also represent all this graphically. We can simply use the expression I put in the upper right corner and plot it. And on the right side, you see that this is the exact same shape as we saw in the graphs before for the Austrian wealth distribution. It's that maybe straight line that gives a kink at the end. And then I've put here a second graph, which is just a straight line. Has anyone any idea where this straight line comes from? There's a little bit of mathematical trickery. So we have this power law function, and if we take the logs, the logarithm on both sides, this power law function will transform into a linear function. Okay? Because if you do a logarithm, the power is taken down and it is simply a factor. Then you have a linear function instead of this complicated thing. And you arrive at this linear function by doing a logarithm on both sides, logarithm of the ranks, logarithm of the wealth. And if you proceed along that line, you see very quickly the advantage, because it's very difficult to give a statistical estimation of the thing on the left side, because it has this nonlinear kink. But it's rather easy to give a statistical estimation of this linear line. So this is the way to do it. We can simply take the ranks and the wealth values, and if we take the logarithm of both, we can do a normal, the simplest regression you know, to get a grip on what is the alpha, the exponent that describes us the intensity of inequality, okay? And with the remaining equations, I declare how that is done. First, we combine an expression for Ni and an expression for the last household governed by the Pareto distribution and all, divide these two by each other, and what we get from there is an expression for the survival function, and the survival function can in turn be then used to estimate all that. So we have here basically this line. This one here is just asking, what is the probability that we observe some person with a wealth greater than xi, and then we can calculate that as x min over xi to the power of alpha. Okay? This is the expression we get. And now we simply take the logs on both sides, then the alpha comes down, and if we reformulate it a little bit, we have an expression that we can really use in a regression. So here you have the rank expressed relatively on the left side, we have the wealth on the far right, and in a regression framework we would have, when we simply put in the rank as the dependent variable and the wealth as the independent variable, we will get here an estimate for the alpha, and here we will get some parameter beta 0 that does not interest us much. So by doing so, you can estimate the intensity of inequality in these distributions simply with Excel or the simplest means you got. All you need is a logarithm and a standard regression, and then you will get an estimate for the intensity of inequality. So easy going, no? We can simply define some lower threshold for which we assume that the Pareto distribution, the power law assumption will hold, and then we can also try different thresholds and see which one works better, and so everything is easy going. The one reason why it's not easy going has nothing to do with mathematics or statistics. It has to do with data acquisition. Okay? And we have several problems when it comes to assessing wealth data. For one, surveys, which are in many cases used to assess private wealth, typically rely on random drawings. We draw people randomly to take part in the survey. Okay? And this works well for many variables, but it does not work well for highly skewed variables, such as the top of the wealth distribution. So this can create errors and be misleading. The second factor is that our measurement is biased if the probability that households participate in the survey itself depends on their wealth. And what we know from studies, you could guess, richer households tend to participate with lower probability, which is called the differential non-response bias. And this can lead to huge underestimations of wealth inequality. For example, I did a study on Austria using the newest data from a European survey. In the raw data, it showed 16% of wealth is held by the top 1%. After doing the corrections that are appropriate to be done, we find it's really rather 41%. Okay? Because these biases can lead to a distortion of the data, so that especially at the top, wealth is massively underrepresented. I have a graph here that illustrates one of these biases, but let me talk about how to remedy this. So what can we do with this 40 data? One thing we can do is we can look at macro data and ask what is in our national accounts, what information is there, can we compare the survey data we have with some national accounts or other aggregate data, and then check, do we have missing wealth or don't we have it? What we also can do is we can use rich lists. So for many countries, Popular Magazine publish a list of the richest people. And if we add those lists to the survey data, we have at least some representation of the very top, which typically massively improves our estimates. Okay? Third strategy would be to simply assume that we miss observations in the top. Okay, assume that we have no rich list, but we know there are several thousand people richer in a given country than the richest one in the survey. Then we can, on this basis, correct the weights of the survey, and again, correct a part of this distortion. And then you can, of course, also use both methods, rich lists and rank correction in combination. So imagine you have a survey, and the richest guy in the survey has 15 million, and then you have a rich list. And the poorest guy in the rich list has 500 million. Then you still have quite a hole. And to fill this gap, to fill this hole, you cannot use the same idea, namely assume, get some intuition how many people will be missing between the poorest one in the rich list and the richest one in the survey. So we have different approaches that help us to remedy bad data and that are also applicable in contexts where we have other forms of data. So basically, these are very flexible tools, and every time you analyze wealth inequality by means of some data, you can go back to these slides and use these tools to look, okay, what degree of inequality do I find? Are these plausible results? Where do I have holes in the data? And is there maybe a remedy for filling up these holes? Okay, so much for the statistical primer for today. Now let's go back to the history of Africa and the question how cumulative advantage map out in the development over the last decades.
Thank you. So now to something where we try to put a little bit of meat on the bones, maybe, give you some actually real-world transformation and how this has kind of worked out, but very much showing the interface between wealth and power and understanding how African countries, how particular countries got from point A to point B. So, I mean, basically, the idea of then applying heterodox theory to look at internal dynamics of economic policy, class, and power. The one thing we didn't hear about so much was this morning was how is it economic theory has contributed to inequality of wealth? How has it led to the policies that have exacerbated the situation internally and externally? A second part of this dynamics of wealth and where African countries are is looking at the nature where Africa fits in the organization of global production, how it relates to the asymmetries of power embedded in there, and how that relates to the unequal wealth. A third is the role of Africa and the financial system, looking at a very different type of financial system rather than this notion of, oh, it's all about simply inflation rates and controlling it. In fact, what we have is enormous asymmetries of power based on where your currency is in the hierarchy of currencies in the world, which very much explains the enormous percentage today, we heard this morning, of debt servicing is going on. And the real problem we'll see is by applying neoclassical and orthodox theory, you simply put in place the continuation of the power symmetries that create the underlying debt. Africa goes from a period of debt to expansion and back into debt crisis. We've seen this now for many decades. And finally, the relationship between neoclassical economics, economic policy, and wealth accumulation. So this was a much longer talk. I had to cut it back. Jakob said, no, you got to get rid of these slides. Okay, all right. So what we had basically, to give you a very simple summary, is that after independence, we had a very Africanized civil service. which left very skewed pay scales, leading to wealth inequality from the beginning, creating elites of well-paid bureaucrats, because they inherited, in many cases, the colonial structure of payment that existed, and with it, the housing and the various trappings of wealth. And so you also had a kind of cumulative advantage in the creation of state marketing boards, which then was utilized to keep producer prices low, both supporting elites, while in some cases using, sometimes problematically, sometimes well, the utilization of surplus and funds to invest in imports, substituting industrialization. In some places, there was a kind of a policy that has huge implications. You put in place in some countries, like in Tanzania, pan-territorial pricing. Didn't matter where you were, you got the same price as a farmer. That was a huge, huge subsidy to farmers that were from great distance to the markets, because they got the same price wherever they were. Didn't have to worry about the transportation costs. And so what happened, in essence, was state elites exercised power over workers by controlling wages, basically, at the same time controlling what wages are paid. In the case of Tanzania, as our colleagues will tell you, the wages were all centrally controlled by the government. Everybody was hired by the government. And the head of the union, you get this, guys, was a minister of labor. Is that like a conflict of interest? Maybe. Okay. And so basically, we know during the earlier period, income and wealth distribution was very scarce. So we can only guess what's going on. Probably it was more equal than certainly what came later. And what we have is an enormous transformation of how neoliberalism dramatically changed the terrain of power, the working rules that affected transactions of farmers and workers, and the modes of accumulation of income and wealth. Spending on agriculture was curtailed. Fertilizer use collapsed, basically, with subsidized farmers. And farmers' incomes disappeared without the existence of state marketing boards, because you then had exploitative middlemen, where farmers didn't have access to credit, transportation, possibly storage facilities, and weakened the powers of farmers. And Foster and I in our project, we've seen this, and all these middlemen in the operation with huge consequences in very measurable ways to wealth and income. So in essence, what we had is a shift of power structures where farmers were forced to sell their crops at a fraction of their wholesale price. And we've documented this. In the first 12 years of our study, we said, okay, what are farmers getting relative to the wholesale price? Often 50% of the price. They explained about the, farmer after farmer explaining about the exploitative nature of middlemen, basically because the terrain of power changed dramatically. Moreover, adjustment, as we've seen, and we'll hear more of this, dramatically changed, reduced social spending. And the idea, as we heard this morning, it's just the government didn't have money. Nonsense. The government simply set the priority here in Uganda to reduce that kind of spending and privatize everything as part of structural adjustment. It was a deliberate process, and in essence, partly because in some cases it was pressure from the World Bank and IMF that thought the private sector can provide everything. I wrote a chapter in a book on this, how the private sector itself can provide everything and just put user fees, in place, with enormous consequences to people's health, and changing the nature of their ability to be able to access healthcare and social goods. We did hear that about this morning, but it was a deliberate policy, not because, the government doesn't have the money. It was a deliberate policy to change the nature of how social goods were being provided. And that has huge implications because inevitably, as we'll hear more about this, is the only way you could begin to pay for things, and that was mentioned this morning, was in fact having to often liquidate your wealth just to deal with your social services. But it's not because it simply was, government didn't have the money. It was a decision here and in many other countries to deliberately change the nature of the way it was provided, with huge consequences to wealth. And of course, those that are then the recipients owning schools or being involved with private schools or being involved with private health care, then got huge amounts of income and accumulated wealth on the other end. Huge changes. And it changes the whole nature of the way these markets are operating with enormous consequences. And so in essence, austerity combined with liberalization and failed privatizations frequently led to the contraction of economic activities, loss of employment and income and wealth, and particularly affecting the poorest segments of the population. And so the other, and we can talk about this whole internal dynamic, how policy changes have huge implications to the nature of wealth, the accumulation of wealth, access to wealth, and the redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich, as well as those trying to survive in the world for the basic needs and substance of humanity. At the same time, we have to talk about the global position, right? What about global production? How did it fit in? What was going on? And in essence, what we had was at a time when African countries were relying, where the global economy, as I point out to my classes, you know, I pick up a computer, I say, how many resources are in this? Very few. It's all about information and technology. When that happened, and this is a crime against humanity, what happened, the World Bank came in and said, you don't really need to have much higher education. And virtually, and you know, people have amnesia sometimes, but it put the universities in crisis in one country after the next. They stopped paying income to them. This was not something that simply happened because it was a government-created crisis. It was an imposed attempt to change the nature of higher education. At the same time, what they did is they came in and they changed the nature of private education, at public school education, and introduced user fees, which was madness. You know, how do you charge poor families money to go to a public school? I mean, no Western country would do that, but here they're imposing this on other countries. And you read through this literature as I had to produce a book from the World Bank, you pull your hair out. It all comes from incredibly ill-conceived neoclassical economic theory. In any sense, the other problem became one of, so you had this dynamic of impoverishment in Africa, at the same time increasing the debt and reliance on international financial organizations. So wealth goes out to be able to support that, and it strengthens the international organizations and changes the asymmetry of power between Western governments and African governments. Because in some senses, if you're cut off, you can't get access to foreign exchange, what do? The only place you could go to in the 1980s and 90s, you can even go to the private markets as you do to some extent today. You could only go to official aid. Official aid said this is the conditionality. But that changed the nature of the rules of the transformation, opened it up to foreign direct investment, and had a huge change in the nature of how wealth was accumulated in African countries versus overseas. Also, one has to talk about what transpired over that period of time. Neoclassical economics pushed Africa into its static comparative advantage, which was exporting resources. And so it then, as the global value chain developed, Africa found itself at the very bottom of the global chain. What does it mean? It means you have no power, you have no employment generation, very little value added, and the terms in trade are completely beyond your capacity to deal with it. So as a global supply chain builds up, Africa's at the bottom. What ends up happening is they're the weakest position power-wise. They get the least income and wealth. And that then contributes to the divide internationally. And so moreover, then what ends up happening is these multinational corporations, today 60% of trade is not between, you know, you get these stupid neoclassical courses on international trade, it's between countries. No, it isn't between countries. Trade today is mostly in subdivisions of one company that go across borders. And they situate that trade in place upon different locations, depending on what's most profitable, where they can undertake their transfer pricing to actually then avoid having to pay taxes on their profits. At the same time, you then have this global value chain in which those at the bottom have the least power, the least income, and the least wealth accumulation. Again, it comes out of the nature, and what assisted the global value chain? It was neoliberalism, because it opened up these economies to unfettered access to foreign investment, to unfettered access to push countries. And if you look at the bias of where foreign investment went into in the 80s and 90s, it was owing to resources, not much else. And at the same time, the manufacturing system collapsed. There was also the issue of financialization, and Jakob talked about it very briefly. What you have then is you have a situation in which you have heightened shareholder pressure. So on top of having this global supply chain, you have then the movement and accumulation of wealth out of the poorest countries to the richest countries. What happens? You have, in essence, salaries and stock options at the upper end. What do they allow? The most ridiculous system is allowing stock buybacks and then giving, in essence, options on shares to CEOs. What do? They sit there and pour all the money, which could be going into production worldwide, increasing productivity, into simply raising their incomes. What does that contribute to? Enormous wealth inequality. And again, it's mostly in the northern countries and much less in the southern countries. And there was a process by which there's also the race to the lowest wage source. Therefore, what ends up happening with this value chain is you have a situation, again, all possible because you use structural adjustment to reduce the barriers for these flows, financially and otherwise. And then so what you end up happening in is the squeezing at the bottom, the accumulation of profits, where wages and labor at the lower end are getting the smallest percentage. And this is not out of some inevitable law of globalization. It's a deliberate reflection of how states set policy and the nature of international power structures underlying the terms and conditions that African countries and others find in the global distribution of value. And so what ended up happening is then structural adjustment sat there. It reduced education, higher education, and period of information technology. They stopped spending money in infrastructure. They stopped spending money on electricity. They stopped spending money basically on healthcare. And in essence said, okay, for foreign direct investment, you can come to Africa. Do you want to set up manufacturing enterprises? Why would we do that? There's no good infrastructure. There's not reliable electricity or water. There's no good ports. There's no good roads. Why would we invest in manufacturing? What do we go there for? Well, we can go float an offshore platform off Nigeria, right? We don't need any labor there. We can actually bring in our own labor. We can go and we can spend the money on that. We don't need roads. There are no roads. Just pick up our boats, and offload the petroleum and take it off. And you see this in country after country of this resource exploitation. Structural adjustment based on neoclassical theory simply pushed Africa back into its static comparative advantage. And as I always talk to my students, and for those that have understand comparative advantage, it's the idea of pushing countries into producing at what you can produce comparatively efficiency, irrespective of what you are producing. And it's kind of, as I point to my students, I say, why would economists tell African countries to get into comparative advantage and specialize it in resources? It's like, it's kind of like talking to your child, right? Would you go to your child and you'd say, if you are the best shoeshine boy and the girl, we'll be very happy with you. As opposed to saying, even if you're a half-assed lawyer or a doctor, you earn thousands of times what you earn as a shoeshine boy or girl. But that's what economists did. They came up and said, look, our theory says follow your comparative advantage, without thinking about what you're producing. It made no logic. I mean, this is one of the things that I talk about at length in other lectures, of how neoclassical economics and neoliberalism has undermined, has caused enormous punishment to African countries and other. And unfortunately, it continues to this moment, And so basically what ended up happening is that African countries got expanded their exports with very little value added. It's been showing up statistically. Very few taxes that remain. And then the neoclassicals and the World Bank came in and said, the best mining laws are to follow and there's a paper on this, follow the Chilean model. The Chilean model was put together by Milton Friedman. Totally unfettered access to resources with no constraints and with no sharing or co-ownership. And so Africa then got put at the very bottom, creating this gross inequality. Another topic I want to talk about again very briefly is the global financial system. Too often, there's this notion that, it's Africa's fault because they're constantly getting a debt crisis because they're not following our advice. Instead of saying, which a neoclassical would never say, what's the nature of the global financial system that creates these crises? How was it created? Where did it come from? Is it something that's natural? And that's one of the great problems here is that you have this hierarchy of currencies, which was deliberately created by the northern countries at the expense of the southern countries. And African countries find themselves at the bottom of the hierarchy of currencies because their currencies don't circulate internationally, they don't cooperate, they end up producing commodities which are in competition with the other, and they're in constant pressure to accumulate dollars, basically, which has now led to another one of these debt crises. We heard with excitement, it's terrible, Uganda's gone from 4 months to 3 months reserves, without saying, why do they need reserves? What's the nature of the system that's created this? Why is it so problematic? And so part of the issue basically is when you push African countries into commodity reliance, you no longer have control over the price you get. Because one thing which is hardly ever discussed is that commodity prices are not set in Africa. You know, you get hit this notion of supply and demand. No, it's set in Chicago. It's set in Frankfurt. It's set at the international commodity markets. And that sets up another incredibly problematic situation of the feedback of wealth inequality. And so what happens then, in essence, is you're relying in your position constantly for price vectors beyond your control, set elsewhere. And in some senses then, you then get in a situation where you're constantly going into crisis, and that means you have to take a loan when you're in crisis. Who do you go to? The IMF. What does the IMF do? It uses the same incredibly simple-minded Pollack model from the 1950s that forces governments in crisis to pro-cyclical interventions, meaning spending less rather than more. Why is that? Because it's the asymmetries of power and wealth accumulation, in some senses, where African countries are constantly in a crisis, not having sufficient reserves, and in turn having to go to the IMF with policies which exacerbate that underlying conditions and inequality. And so African countries typically go to great lengths to avoid the IMF, right, for financial support. And so they build up their reserves. Where do they put their reserves? Well, you know, they park them in New York, in the financial markets, on U.S., it's sitting on U.S. T-bills, et cetera. So it's another wealth movement from Africa to the developed world, to the Western countries, enhancing the currency hierarchies. And it's insanity, because in some sense, I had a huge argument some years ago with the central banker of Nigeria, and I said, at the time, the United States was in an Iraq war, I said, why is Nigeria financing the Iraq war? You know, and we had this huge argument, and his bodyguard, I think, with a gun came with me to try to pull me away. It was at a meeting that I had that Stiglitz used to organize, the Africa Task Force. And, you know, and so what had happened was that they had at that point something like $44 billion sitting in New York, doing nothing, but adding to the wealth and reserves of the United States. You know, and it's an insane system. And if they could have been in a different world, bringing that money back to begin to transform your economy and invest in changing the nature of how production occurs, diversifying your economies. So you get in a situation where African governments are basically constantly in a vicious cycle of commodity dependence. Because when commodity prices go up, what do? You build the reserves for the inevitable crisis that's going to come beyond your control, right? And when it comes, the reserves go back down. And they go back down far enough, you're hit by so many shocks, like the war in Ukraine and COVID, then invariably you're back in the hands of the IMF anyway. And so you have this situation of enormous global power asymmetries and the movement of the wealth in the wrong direction. And so we have then a situation that you have this financial subordination. So in essence then, it generates, and at the same time, it leads to these vast holdings of dollar reserves, which contributes to what is dollar hegemony. At the very top, the United States gets a free pass. They can produce whatever dollars they want. It gets picked up by the world. They never have to worry about the IMF coming in and saying, no, you have to install austerity and cut back on your spending. And so what you have then is you have this perpetuation of a system that feeds into, you know, what Jakob is talking about, this cumulative dynamic of inequality, wealth, and power. And so what we have then is this kind of neoclassical justification. You know, so what they do is they say, oh, we don't talk about these systems, which will use a whole different set of theories and ideas of how the globe operates. They sit there, you know, and I've just finished a paper on the on the debt crisis in Zambia. And what do they write? You read these IMF documents. I've been reading these IMF documents for decades, and I say, why haven't they changed? It kind of reminds me, and the evidence is overwhelming how problematic it is economically, but it kind of reminds me of the area of medicine, right? So it's like medicine is in the world still of bloodletting to heal diseases. The idea you have foul blood, and that's how you cure it. Put a leech on you, draw the blood out, and now you get healthy. And this is the same kind of thinking that IMF has. And of course, what it does is it feeds the system of power inequity and power asymmetries, and this movement of wealth in the wrong direction. And so it's always, I read these things, what do they blame the crisis on? well, you know, lack of exchangeability, it's poor developed financial systems, weak institutional capacities, mismanagement. In Zambia, they sat there and said, well, the government just needs more independence in the central bank and the right to document. So they have this long list of neoliberal conditionality, which worsens the conditions of power in these countries relative internationally. So in some senses then, what happens with the neoclassicals, what do? Fiscal and monetary responsibility, flexible exchange rates, deregulation to attract FDI, develop bond and securities markets, capital liberalization, simply be a pawn in the global system. And so the idea is that, you know, is also, which has been very popular, is the idea of capital account liberalization. You know, and what you say basically, and this was put in place, and by the way, we have here, which was mentioned this morning, the most open capital liberalization in Africa, here in Uganda. Anybody can move money in and out, really, with no constraints, which is insane because it creates such instability. And so the idea came from neoclassical theory. Free capital mobility allows flows to move from the wealthier countries with a low marginal productivity of capital. Again, we're back to the theory of marginal product. With a high margin product capital, market equalizes across border risk-adjusted market products. Equilibrium. Everything always equalizes. It's kind of like water, you know? This is the world we live in, or what I call badly defined metaphors from 19th century physics about equilibrium. And so what we have then is the idea is that, and this led to the capital account liberalization, African countries will get richer, they'll get wealthier simply to tap foreign exchange by augmenting investment, lower interest rates, and it would automatically have capital moving from areas where there's a low return to capital to a high return to capital because of the shortage of capital in African countries. And countries like Africa will be the winners since they get higher investment and consumption with lower interest rates and opportunity to participate in global risk sharing, while capital from rich countries get a higher return. The problem of this is there's no evidence this happens in reality. And so we had then in neoclassical economics something called the Lucas paradox. And so, so you had this prediction, which led to capital account liberalization. It was actually going to be part of the IMF in terms of agreement back in the 1990s. It changed. They backed off because of the Asian crisis. And so what happens is you end up then, you read this literature, instead of saying, maybe we're wrong about how the world works, they invent all these things to try to rescue this theory. Instead of saying, oh, what's wrong with our theory? No, they wouldn't admit to that. And so what happens then basically is that it has huge implications for the trajectory of development in poor countries, basically. And what ends up happening is that a lot of countries took it on full board, including Ghana and Zambia, which are now in a crisis. Here in Uganda, it's just struggling, basically. And it led to what in essence has been this constant process of trying to build reserves, partly as a mechanism to try to defend yourself from capital outflows, which inevitably happen. That doesn't happen if you have capital controls. Do you have somebody talked about China falling neoclassical. No, China's never had capital account liberalization. They're not stupid like that. And as a result, it's helped them to control the flows and accumulations of their countries. The final thing I want to say before we close is that is the issue of commodities. And what has happened, if people have studied, like myself, is you go and you see what's happened with the concentration of global wealth with implications to the conditions of survival in African countries. So we now have a situation, and it's well documented, is we've had a huge increase, as global wealth has increased, we've had the movement into hedge funds of something like, I don't know, $20, $30 billion up into 4 or 5 trillion today. And where does that money go? Among other things, it speculates on derivatives in commodity markets. And so they move very quickly even into food. Over short periods of time, you think the price is going to go up. And in the process, drive the price up. And if you look at why prices go up with food, with implications to people's incomes and wealth, it's precisely because then a lot of internationally traded food, like maize, has huge implications because the price goes up and down depending on what's going on in these markets. And so there is no regulation. It came out of the deregulation against from neoclassical economics, out of a 2000 transformation, the deregulation of the commodity markets by the United States. And so that's had huge implications as well, which needs to be discussed. So I'm going to let my colleague Jakob to finish and conclude.
Yeah, thanks. Everything that is on this slide has already been said. So we would say that the distribution of wealth has some typical characteristics and has many impacts. We said it's highly unequal and of similar proportions, no matter where we look. We said it's a major determinant for individual well-being and also for social welfare. It is something that arises endogenously from our economic system, from capitalism, or more generally maybe systems based on private property. It has certain formal properties that we can exploit to better understand it and also to tackle problems of missing or incomplete data. And what we also saw is that, especially in the last part, that it's not only a product of pure economic mechanisms, but we saw very well how there is an interplay with other social spheres like politics, science, or culture that add additional feedback loops and thereby reinforce the patterns that we find. Thanks a lot also from my side.
Professor, allow me to appreciate you for that insightful presentation. I have observation and a question. I'm Simon Peter Ola from Gul University Institute of Peace and Strategic Studies. You have tackled it very well on your classical economics, especially on the skill-biased technological change and economics of superstars. Prof, when you look at the current situation in Uganda, we are going to create classes of Ugandans, educated Ugandans. But within educated Ugandans, we are going to create classes. The first class would be the class of advanced educated people. Then the second class, we are going to create class of middle educated people. Then we are going to create a class of low educated people. But if we are to consider their qualification, all would have qualified with bachelor's or master's degrees. Why am I bringing this? Where I come from in Gulu, the majority of parents are bringing their children here in Kampala because they believe Kampala schools have better facilities and the performance is also good. Now, in the morning you have seen, Acholi sub-region is the poorest from Uganda, is the poorest sub-region. But every year, we spend about 3 billion paying school fees in Kampala. That's a lot of money. Now, let's look at this parent who failed to bring the child to Kampala. A child started primary one from Gulu, secondary in Gulu, and finally graduated from Gulu. And he did a course in agriculture from an institution which has no, let me say, has no farm. It means this student has a degree, all right, but what he has is theoretical. Then we have the second class that studied from Kampala with a little practical component of it. Then we have parents from Kampala who are sending their children to study abroad. This class is coming back with high technological knowledge. They can operate these complicated machines, meaning that when we are leaving the market to determine labor, these ones who studied from abroad They are going to be employed and they will earn highly. Then this second group that studied from Kampala is also going to be employed. They will earn somehow. Then this other category who only attain or acquired theoretical knowledge, where are we going to put them? Meaning that the education system is also helping in widening the income inequality. Then you talked about deregulation, liberalization, retrenchment, and others. Of course, this was done in good faith, especially after the 1970s economic crisis that hit African continent. And according to the research which was done, the advice was the only medicine was to do this, actually was to come up with the adjustment program policies. Now, Prof, liberalization literally helped in kicking out these young growing infant industries and bringing in foreign direct investment. And of course, the retrenchment policy, of course, it was done in good faith. We are looking at effectiveness in service delivery. But instead, these people were laid off. And remember, in Uganda, we have very poor saving culture. We don't save. And these people who are retrenched, they went back home and they failed to pay their children at school, meaning that it has actually widened the income gap. Now, my question to you, do you think if this policy was done in phases, would have helped in narrowing the income gap, or do you think it was done at the right time? Thank you.
Thank you. I want once again to appreciate also Professor Howard and Jacob for giving us such wonderful insight. My name is Francis Mugoda from Moni, and I want to share something maybe in relation to wealth and power that we have just been sharing with you. And actually, right from the beginning, you brought out very vividly that those who are rich will continue being rich. Those who are poor, actually, they will remove whatever, even what they have, and the rich will take it away. This brings us to even the point that even when you have something, you cannot access the market because you don't have the capacity, or you cannot add value to what so far you have produced. Therefore, like you have just said also, most of the businesses that are in African countries, especially, for example, Uganda, are managed, are owned by the rich people. And for them, when they want to accumulate money, for example, in 1 week, they connive because they know each other, and then they hoard. They make the product become scarce on the market. And when they hoard it, they will obviously hike the price more than even twice of that product so that they can be able to accumulate wealth within that shortest period of time. And that is the phenomenon with the business community here in Africa. They don't consider the poor person who is earning less than $1 a week or a day. And just because the politics of African leadership has got a bent that for you to manage and be able to rule somebody when you are in power, you need to make that person poor. That is one of the things that our leadership in most of the African countries think, that when you are a subject and you have resources, you will be unruly, which is actually a very wrong perception. But that is the reality on the ground. And so that they want to have the monopoly of all of the sources that can come to their treasury. Now, as we were discussing, I was asking myself, and I usually keep on asking myself, we don't have resources to make sure that we are able to help even those ones who are very poor to have something that they can be able to move from one level to another? Is it because of the level of education? Is it because the market, or because of the taxes? Generally, as you look at the African perspective, like even considering the recent census that we had in Uganda, majority of our population are women. And when you look at the women who are more than the other counterparts, most of them are either semi-illiterate or they are illiterate, and they live in rural communities. Now, what I would think is that we have, in Africa, we have, as you were sharing today in the morning hours about the livelihood framework, one of the key things that I noted that we have as Africans is the social capital. Because that social capital can change trends of things to happen in the lives of the people. Is it because our mindset is just treated in one angle? We only think of what will I eat? What will I eat? How will I be able to survive? And we become so much dependent on other people, or we want the government every time to be providing to us. I was thinking that maybe those could be one of the issues that are causing wealth disparity among us. And there is a very big margin between the rich and the poor. I'm just now asking to you, do you think if we take the university to the communities, because the universities have got a very wider capacity of enriching the community with what has been so far researched. They may be there in the communities, but when they don't know what is happening, because they are not aware. So do you think if we take the universities with all the expertise that we have to the communities, will it be able to increase on wealth? Will it be able to reduce on the wealth disparity? Do you think if, for example, we do a multifaceted approach of supporting those who are rich, but also not ignoring those who are not rich, so that we can move at the same level to make sure that we all have in wealth equality? Do you think it could be a solution for the African countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe, a very quick one. Actually, following on the two questioners there, I want to present this to Professor Howard. I'm asking myself, why is the cause-net theory is not working in agrarian society, and that is our developing countries? And then secondly, maybe this is to Jakob. Can we be right to say that socialism, like in some European countries, is very much operating on the heterodox economic principles? That is something that I probably want to know. And then lastly, on the financial system, there is something very interesting happening in Nigeria right now that is related to the oil refinery that this richest man of Africa, or the second richest rather, the richest in South Africa. So Dangote. Dangote is trying to supply oil, particularly in Nigeria, the very country where it's situated, and they're selling their oil in Naira. Now, the interesting thing is based on what you mentioned about the financial system, and that is, what would you say about the interest that Russia is trying to promote about using the ruble as another center of financial strength? And then, of course, that relates to the Chinese yuan. because China being the heart of industrial production at the moment, how do we really ensure that the developing countries also have their currency probably strengthened, other than remaining very low on the economic chain? I think that's my question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my name is Mary Makerere from Kabari University. I've just been here critically thinking as to whether being poor is a permanent curse. Because as we are seeing, it's as if the poor must remain poor as the rich become wealthier. Who has the power? It is the rich. From a local perspective, if you look around, you find who makes decisions? The rich person. The children of the rich will continue to be rich. Why? Because they have to go to good schools, they have access to the jobs. In any case, it's their fathers who are sitting there. When it comes to political positions, a poor person cannot win election. However good you are, simply because you do not have the money. So they have to sit in those positions and make decisions that govern everything. If you think about what power holds, it is those who have the power that have to control the resources. And if you talk about modernizing agriculture, a poor person will be the producer, but there's a middleman who has to get the higher price for the goods that are being made. At a higher level, the one who manufactures will add the value on the goods and commodities and gets the highest price. And of course, it goes through the ranks of wealth. So that means, even as we talk about the vulnerable persons in our community, how can they get out of the vulnerability? Comparatively at the international level, it is the same trend. Who makes the decisions on trade? It is those people from the global south to the global north. Who determines the policies in Africa and in Uganda? The very people, the donors, and how we should move. So how can Africa get out of its vulnerability? Of course, it is the same trend. Whatever policies that are being passed, we talk about the structural adjustment policies. It is the very people who determine the policies. So you find you can't produce, even our goods will be labeled substandard. And we must keep dancing to the tune. And I think this question continues to disturb me. When shall we have the power? We don't even have it. You need the technological power, which we don't have. We are moving behind what the Western world has is what we have to adopt. When they are stopping it, we are starting it. So we shall remain many miles behind the political power. Even if you talk about whatever power you talk about, the expertise power, it is not there. So how can Africa, this is my big question, what strategies should be adopted by developing countries to get out of poverty, to accumulate the wealth? I think this is what I'm trying to think about. Maybe we need to think outside the box. We may not beat others in technology. Maybe you can concentrate on a rich culture or tourism or whatever that others cannot have. Just like we have seen, maybe those who are talented athletes can get out of poverty using the special talents. I'm thinking there's need for poor countries maybe to define their niche and see where they can compete, maybe get the competitive advantage over others that have other certain kinds of power, and maybe start from there. But I see it's a very long route. Even as we are thinking, we empower a farmer in the village, still there will be exploitation, and they may not do much to decide. But these are big questions. I don't have the answers. Probably you could help me to find some of them. Thank you so much.
Hello. I'm Prosi Nambi. I thank you, Professor Howard and Professor Jacob, for the good presentation. After the presentation, I realized that we Africans, grass is not greener on our side when it comes to inequality. But there were some solutions that came up. I would like you to justify or expand more on the practicability of heterodox economics and its principles to the majority voiceless people or the marginalized who are the most affected by wealth inequality. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I am Mohamed Nyago, a student at Makerere University. So my question goes to Professor Howard Stein. The core problem that we have based on the presentation is historically structure. And if we are to deal with the question of inequality, it means we have to grapple with the structure itself. And this structure is both global and national, but both of them share a particular logic. So are there conditions of possibility for emancipation and liberation from this structure for the African countries and other countries in the global south to get out of this? Or are we stuck with this structure, and so meaning we are stuck with this kind of inequality? Thank you.
Let us first stop for the respond, and then we'll take another round.
Yeah, I think my pleasure is to recognize that most questions were directed to Howard anyway. I can say a little bit about the general development thing and heterodox economics. So there was the question whether, if I understood correctly, it was phrased like whether socialism in Europe is based on heterodox theorizing. And the answer is, I would say that there is no socialism in Europe. What we have is social democratic welfare states. Some are left, others are under restructuring. And these social democratic welfare states, I would argue, build on heterodox theorizing. So if you look into the programmatics of the politicians back then who built that welfare state, you find references to Keynes, you will find references to Marx, you will find references to the institutionalists like John Kenneth Galbraith or Gunnar Myrdal. So basically 3 of those heterodox schools, post-Keynesianism, radical economics, Marxist economics, and institutionalism, stand out as being the historical inspiration for the welfare states from the viewpoint of economic theory. There's a second dimension to this story that is about a labor movement and has an intellectual life on its own, or has had an intellectual life on its own, and where there are overlaps to basically this academic history. But I would argue that these are the intellectual pillars. So this self-education in form of a 150-year-old labor movement, plus inspiration from such heterodox approaches, effectively have helped build the European welfare states. And we also see that the restructuring and the dismantling of European welfare states typically goes hand in hand with an exchange of the intellectual foundations. So as soon as social democratic parties rewrite their party manifestos and cross out the heterodox sources and replace it with neoclassical jargon, we typically do not have to wait long to see also a turn in applied politics and more neoclassical thinking in these parties and in their manifestos will typically lead to a reduction of welfare state activity. So yes, I would argue that you see a correlation here between the ideas on which we draw and the political development we observe then on the macro level, and this also gives some indication that heterodox theorizing can indeed, it's probably not flawless and not not sacrosanct in any sense, but so we can still make mistakes and there can be errors. But we see that, of course, we can use these tools and these concepts as a guide for designing applied economic and social policy. And if you look, for example, I mean, this is probably not an exhaustive answer, but there was also another question raising the issue, so how to engineer, or there were, I think, 3 or 4 questions raising the issue, how to engineer, is it possible to engineer a catch-up process for African countries? And if we look into history, at least till 1990 or so, becoming a rich country always meant becoming industrialized. And if we look in the history here, we find that those countries that successfully industrialized, which are maybe not too many after industrialization in Europe and the US in the mid of the 19th century, but also in these cases, catch-up development was always guided by heterodox theorizing. Why? Because you can become a world leader in manufacturing by being the first country that really manufactures stuff on large scale. This would be the UK. And then all the other countries in Europe had the challenge how to catch up to the UK. And they did catch up, and also the US did catch up to the UK, not by means of free trade and capital inflows, but rather by the opposite strategy. They did catch up by protectionist measures, by closing down financial flows, by regulating trade flows, and by building domestic capacities. And education was one sphere in which such capacities have been built, but other crucial areas were to develop an autonomous financial sector and were to develop a well-functioning, encompassing transport system, and a general idea to strengthen public sector infrastructures, because a public sector infrastructure can very often be much more efficient than decentralized economic activity. So if you look at the Bola drivers here, this is all working well. I can get from A to B, but it would be much more efficient in terms of hours invested, emissions created, if we simply had a public transport system. Because we can then facilitate transport on a larger scale. So again, not only for the case of welfare states, but also for the case of catch-up development, we find that heterodox theorizing and heterodox approaches have been a key inspiration. So in the classic heterodox development model, you would say we have to get capital controls, we have to regulate trade, we have to build our own financial sector, we have to build basic infrastructures in transport, and then maybe the 4th method would be to educate people, which is, as far as understood, currently the primary measure.
Thank you all for wonderful questions. I'm going to try to, because there were so many, not go individually, but address some of the general questions that are interconnected and some of the themes that come out. Let me begin just by saying that in 2 weeks, I'll be going to a meeting at the African Union, working with a group there called the Consortium on the Dialogue in Africa. And the head of Consortium has been exceedingly frustrated for years because, she says, how do we change and deal with the issues? All we have is a bunch of these economists that don't have any understanding of what the problem is or how to address it. So it's not just understanding the sense of the, not just saying, oh, here's our solutions. You have to be able to diagnose what the problem is in the first place. And neoclassical economics simply doesn't have tools. They don't have theories of structures in their analysis because everything's methodological individuals. I go at length. I'm hard hitting on neoclassical economics because it's done such damage in the world. I've survived, but as an economist, where do I get hired? Epidemiology, African studies, certainly not the economics department. They probably don't even think I'm a real economist. What do you mean talking about structures? What do you mean talking about institutions? What do you mean talking about power? But those are the very heart of understanding how an economy operates, and this is what's crucial. But in some senses, the theory glosses over and acts as a legitimacy of existing system because they don't understand the system. They just say there's some kind of natural underlying dynamic that leads to the outcome. Okay, so enough more of my editorializing. You raised some really good questions. Okay, so let's begin with the issue of finance and how do you actually get out of this system, which is incredibly crucial. And you have to understand what money is. Money is a store of value, unit of account, means of payment, standard of deferred payment, and has to play that role as a function. And so the key really always, when we're looking at transformation in Africa, is African countries, they don't need to go to China, you shouldn't be going to Russia. African countries need to go with themselves to begin to set up a situation where they begin to accept other African currencies for goods and services. That's the starting point. It never happens. What happens is every central bank sits there and says, I have a transaction, between Zimbabwe, and Tanzania. Well, Zimbabwe gets the Tanzanian currencies. They say, well, you got to transfer it into dollars to pay for our goods. And the other way around, Zimbabwean dollars back to dollars, and then to be able to pay for the commodities. It's insane, because every single one of these transactions strengthens the US dollar. So what do? You begin to set up swaps. You end up basically saying, I'll accept your currency, you accept my currency. We kind of have a balance. And the best system would really be at the continental level. I wrote a paper recently with a former PhD student of mine, talking about how we can create an African green bank to finance, with the whole mechanism of how we can set the whole thing up. But the crucial thing is, there are two aspects of that. One is beginning to accept each other's currency. And there's been models we can follow that were attempted in Latin America and elsewhere. And the second thing, and you can have kind of a central clearinghouse on this, and you need to kind of back the bank with international currency and reserves. But anyway, a second thing was absolutely central is industrial policy on the continent. What does that mean? It means you have to begin to develop manufacturing, not simply shipping coffee out. So is Uganda saying, we'd be much better off buying Tanzania coffee, right? And Tanzania say, yeah, we really want Uganda coffee. No, that's not going to go anywhere, guys. What needs to happen is each have to have a complementary manufacturing plants that they can trade with. And I made this argument way back in 1999 at a lecture at the East African Community, and they didn't have a clue because when they created it, they said, well, we just need to have a free trade zone. I said, no, you should be utilizing free trade to create specialization in manufacturing so you can begin to trade. So the key really is here, right? You want to be able to develop the functions of money, possibly leading eventually to an African currency, which in essence then takes on the unit of account. You begin to measure and look, it's a long lecture, guys. I don't want to go into it in a lot of detail. But thinking through and understanding money as an institution and how you build it up and how it relates to the real economy is what heterodox economists do. This is what we think through, to come up with it. And we can set this system, but you talk to most central bankers, they have the same money and banking training that they get in the United States, and they're not at all thinking about anything but controlling their money supply, because that's your basis for controlling inflation. But you have to begin to exit out of the global financial system with your own financial system in place, with industrial policy. So do neoclassicals in the World Bank believe in industrial policy in Africa? No. The very famous comment is, states should not choose winners, and leading the liberalization. And way back when, in 1992, I wrote a paper which predicted structural adjustment to deindustrialize Africa, and it did. It was pretty obvious that was going to lead to that. So it's been around for a long time. There's ways to get out of it, basically. So let me go back into other issues of income inequality. So we need to conceptualize in structural terms. We need to then begin to think of modalities of organization institutions that can organize the continent with a whole different set of tools of understanding how the real world operates. So getting into the issue, and then we can get a whole discussion of BRICS and whether they provide a financial system. As I said, getting into the politics, China and Russia have their own agenda, right? I would say never get involved. To anybody ever asked me, don't take sides on the Ukraine-Russia war, but don't also associate it with a fascist government. But beyond that, be neutral. Be smart. Play one off the other in global politics. But in any sense, I won't get into that. But so in essence, if we then go into the issue of how wealth is reproduced, and education, one of the mechanisms of the great equity in education is providing access to high quality education to poor people. You know, and if you go through the market and commodify it, the rich people get the best education, the poor people get the worst education, if at all. And that's what's really happened in this country and so many other African countries. Same thing in healthcare, which I'll talk about. So there is ways in which you create a level playing field and you begin to change the dynamics of wealth accumulation by, in fact, then finding the different levels of accessibility. It's the same thing with finance. This morning we heard, Dr. Fred, he's the head of a bank. It's terrible they give to these people go poor, they build a building, they don't sell it. But what government should be thinking about, and this is what China did, is getting access to finance to manufacturers. And there's risk associated with it. And there's a whole set of models historically in which you begin to choose winners, begin to support the manufacturing process. It's risky, it takes time. The market basically, and I worked in finance over a long period of time, open markets, for development, having kind of the American arm's length model doesn't work. You need to have directed credit for productive purposes, and it can be the private sector combined with the private and state sector, but there's ways to doing it, and there's a whole set of institutions being put in place. I've been working for, I wrote the UNECA report in 2014, talking how you build institutions for industrialization and industrial policy in Africa, and been trying to I've been trying to put that into an Oxford book. I had a contract for 8 years, but okay, it'll come out eventually, guys, which will lay out how you begin to build institutions for industrial policy in Africa. Kuznets, sorry, I'm running all around. Kuznets basically, why we have income inequality? Why is Kuznets wrong? Because you already, and I'll talk about it with Faustin and I tomorrow, you have huge inequality of land access already, right? So agriculture is not equal. And it leads to all sorts of changes of income. Huge differences going on. The Gini coefficients on land are just, in our collection, are just frightening, how high they are. In Tanzania, socialist country, it looks like the latifundia countries of Latin America. It's hair pulling. And so, and the growth of landlessness. And so you're getting class formation, which of poor people that are landless and increasingly leading to the proletarianization of the rural population, having to sell their labor at low prices. Or almost every family can't survive of agriculture unless you have large-scale amount of land. So they diversify their income sources. And understanding that transformation and change is really important. But it's because Kuznets is just, he just has a simple-minded notion. Land, it's equal, it's distributed, that's what your marginal product of return is, and hence it has to be equal. But when you get into industrialization, then you get more concentration of land, and more people go to the urban areas, and it rises, and then it falls when it gets low enough. And this is a simple-minded theory, but it blows my mind that that's the case. So I've hit a lot of different points. I probably missed a few things. I apologize. But there is ways in which you can use social good. It's one of the reasons why, as I'll talk about in my talk, you need to decommodify social, to deal with wealth inequalities, you really have to decommodify social goods. They have to be pulled off the market, or it creates this dynamics of the reproduction of wealth, which we see on every single social goods, and enormous impoverization, the loss of wealth, as people actually then liquidate whatever wealth they have, just to do the one thing they're trying to do. I mean, everybody wants to educate their children, because that's the route to the future. And it's incredibly problematic, the kind of barriers. So let me shut up there. There's probably a few things that can come to back later, but let's open up the floor for more questions. Sorry. How long do we have? Another round? Or we have one more round?
We have a question online. You left? Let's enable the participants online to ask.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you, Professors Howard and Jacob. I just have one quick question and observation that all the all the different theories we are talking about are so much reliant on data. And believe you or me, is that in our daily work that we do, the question of data is very, very important, even to do the measurement of all these kinds of inequalities. You gave us very interesting options, the 4 options about the rich lists and the correction, and then the rank corrections and all those. But my question is typically from a practitioner's perspective. My name is Tom, and I do consultancies related to land and inequalities in various aspects of life, humanitarian assistance and all this. And the biggest challenge has been data. So are there any other, could we try to come up with more innovations on how to measure the inequalities other than this? Because if we look at the current sources of data that we have, we definitely don't see them as quite accurate in terms of macro and micro. Even we don't have clear tracer studies on some of these wealth accumulations. So I'm basically trying to think through, and if you could advise us on a little more options where I could maybe extrapolate data so that we could be able to try and calculate inequalities. Because without data, I think we are going to keep having a lot of narratives without actual data or near to something to do with accurate data. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My question is, as we have talked, you can see that the African economy, raising the African economy and sustaining it is in the hands of our leaders. My question is, I'm asking the question to all Africans for the sake of our continent. Most of you here and the rest who are online have had some kind of leadership in those offices. It might be small, but you've been a leader. My question is to you, the elect. What have you done in such offices? You make us look as if we are stupid. We have the skills, we have the resources, but whatever you do, it is not the ministers, it is not the president, it is each of us. What do we do in those offices to represent this continent? Thank you.
Hello, Dirango Ngunjiri from the University of Nairobi, Kenya. I can continue from where she has left about the African leadership. You know, after the post-colonization in Africa, we had what we call comparative advantage. The African, we are told, you are good in agriculture, you should not produce, and we should not manufacture. And we don't manufacture in Africa. We made that the West, you are doing the manufacture, we export the raw material. That's why my grandmother in central Kenya farmed the coffee, exported raw coffee to the beans to UK for processing. When the coffee is back in the country, she cannot buy even a kg of the coffee for her to drink. She's just a farmer and cannot consume the same coffee. And then the same coffee, it is paid at the end of the year. Maybe the dollar has changed, and after 1 year, that's when she's been paid for her produce. This is one of the things you find that now the West now has come another ideology, climate change and carbon trade. After destroying the climate, now they are coming that we shall be paying you carbon credit. I think there's some stupidity, sorry to say so, because as Africans, we have the resources required to do the manufacturing. As Africans, we have the skills and knowledge. But the other now, they have come with another script that we're going to export skills to the West. Last week, the president of Kenya was in Germany on signing an agreement of exporting skills to Germany. Whereas in Africa, we still require these skills. Why don't you use the skills in Africa? Why don't you develop Africans and Africans? As Africans, we know our problems, we know our solution. The problem is we Africans, as you said, we are the biggest problem. The governance, one of the big issue, especially the political governance, there's a link in there where the governance can come on board. The other thing you find that in most of the African countries, or some of the African countries, they are very much unstable. There's wars or whatever, unstable government. And after doing some research, you might find the Western countries are involved in this. They are still making DRC Congo to be unstable for them to get the resources at a cheaper rate. I think it's high time as African we come up strongly and stand for Africa and work for Africa to make Africa develop compared to the Western. Because I don't see the sense why UK or Britain is the size of Nyanza in our province in Kenya, Nyanza, and is expecting to whole of Africa and global world. And whereas Africa, in our 63 countries, we are not able to export anything, any finished products. The policies we have in this Africa, they are written somewhere in US and then brought to Africa. And this is practicable. What is done in US, in the Western countries, the global North, cannot be implied in Africa. Let's come up with our own policy, global South-based policies. And as scholars in the global South, it's high time we come with our policies and implement the policies. Let us not do only academic research. Let's do policy-based research and scholarly work that we're able to improve Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Shifa Wahab from the Islamic University in Uganda. My issue is about Africa and the global production. We are all aware that most countries in Africa depend on agriculture, but it seems we are also not doing well as far as that sector is concerned, because the resource that we have that depends on agriculture, the land has been distorted. One, previously, as Africans, we used to grow our crops using organic seeds with minimal use of fertilizers. But in the name of modernization, small-scale farmers have been told to adopt the use of genetically modified seeds. Now you find today on the global market that products that have been grown using genetically modified seeds, they have a relatively cheaper price compared to the organically grown crops. Now, after being buried into this issue of modernization using fertilizers, chemicals, genetically modified foods, you see that the price of the other products is actually high. Now you find that in the US actually has reserves of all the organic seeds from Africa, whereby now for us, if you're looking for these seeds, you cannot get them. Instead, the small-scale farmers who contribute the largest percentage of farming production in Uganda, for example, they have to buy, they are sold the genetically modified foods. So don't we think that the West is also contributing to widening the wealthy inequality gap in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Bam. I think the problem of inequality derives far back from the colonial era. So the only thing that like African countries should do, adopt, is to strengthen on mindset change to ensure that they can become self-reliant. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Howard and Dr. Jacob, for the wonderful presentation. My name is Martin Chamanywa, a staff from the Department of Development Studies. First of all, in development studies, largely the discipline is characterized by three key features: interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, and then the use of the political economy approach. So when we are discussing the heterodox approach, you were in line with the discipline, because we believe real life problems are not linear. Real life problems are multifaceted, they are deep rooted, and so it requires a broad thinking and approach. Now, you mentioned that success breeds success and failure breeds failure. In Africa, most of the poor have given up. They're in a condition of what we call fatalism. They believe that no change can be done, and so most of them have given up on life. So this perpetuates poverty, it perpetuates the inequality that you've been talking about here. Now, when we come to the structural adjustment policies, it's true there were highs and lows, but I believe this is one of the biggest mistakes that the Africans did. Of course, there were conditionalities at that time. The Africans were having a political and economic crisis, So they wanted to be built out, but as we've been discussing, indeed, a number of problems really came out of this. But one of them is opening up the markets. With liberalization, we opened up our markets to the Western world. And so our industries could not really compete. And of course, the cuts in social service expenditure in health and education really led to a loss of almost over 2 decades of our human resource development. And there's no way how a country can develop with a sick or uneducated population. And still, as you're talking about these SAPs, you were really sort of speaking to dependency theory. Dependency theory blames the underdevelopment of the African continent on capitalism and some of these thinking, these ideologies. So what is the solution? Many people have been lamenting. Some of them have been saying, no, there's nothing that we can do to get out of this perpetual poverty and inequality. But there are solutions. One of the solutions is mindset change. Africans should start looking inwards. What do we have? What resources do we have? And so what can we borrow from outside? This is what we call the principle of endogeneity. The true development has to come within. Now, if you are going to get any resources, any assistance in terms of ideas, in terms of economic policies, in terms of ideologies, we must modify them to suit our circumstances, our local conditions. And then, of course, the other solution could be the adoption of regional integration, because we believe with the strengthening of regional integration institutions on the African continent, we'll be able to boost our political and economic power such that we are able to compete in this global village, which has really continued to peripherize the third world further and further in the margins. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Dixon from University of Johannesburg. I would want to respectfully disagree with Professor Howard that your classic economists don't know what they are doing. I think they know what they are doing. We need to ask ourselves, who benefits from wealth inequality? Who is promoting it? For example, I will give you an example like Botswana. Botswana's independence was negotiated by De Beers. This is a diamond company, which is still running 50% of their diamond. So who's benefiting from it? This is a UK company and South African company. Maybe looking at the financial structure you're talking about, we have had African leaders who have tried. We had Gaddafi. You know what happened to him? I know how Libya, the state it is in. We had also Mbeki of South Africa, who was like the elite, the software of Gaddafi. He was also removed from power before his term ended. So with this, I also want to agree with Jacob on alternative. As Africans, we need to look for alternative policies. We need to develop our own knowledge. Otherwise, we shall consume the knowledge they are creating, and the situation will remain the same. And they want us to be in that position where Africans are blaming Africans. All this, as Professor had said, he was part of IMF, he's going to African Union. African Union will push an agenda to us. You know, finally, who is sponsoring that African Union? Who is sponsoring the East African Integration Regional Blocks? And what's their interest? So we need to ask these questions to ourselves so that we find solutions for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Howard and Professor Jacob, for your presentation. It was really insightful. I'm called Ainemkama Fortunate Mirembe. I am a monitoring and evaluations specialist, and I work as a monitoring and evaluation assistant at Bustema University. I had my one observation. I noted that the data based on the presentation was a bit old. I saw 2004, 2012. I didn't see the latest literature concerning the neoliberalism and neoclassical economics. And point number 2, there's one of our musicians in Uganda sang a song called Mbeda. Do you all know about Mbeda? Yes. And he had a lot of things he talked about. Omwana Omugaga, maybe for the people who don't know Uganda, children of the rich, they are driving Mercedes-Benzes after graduation, and children of the poor with a good education, very well with first-class degrees, they are in Chikubo. Our Chikubo, I mean the marketplaces. They are down there carrying loads of things for the children of the rich, and the rich are just there enjoying life. I'm triggered to think about our education systems. Don't you think the challenge is with the education systems? When we look at China, many clips have always gone through online, seeing how children in China are learning having practicals in industries, learning. But how about in our African setting, in Uganda, in Makerere University as well? What kind of systems have we put in place that if next year by January, when they're passing graduates over 2,000, 1,000, 10,000 graduates every year, what have they learned? Is it all theoretical? Do they have practical skills that even if they don't get something practical in the outside, they can be able to survive with the education they have gotten? Because many people after school, they run now to look for jobs that they have not even studied. They're now practicing really irrelevant things from what they have learned on paper, from what they have as their academic transcripts and certificates. Thank you so much.
Can we respond?
Yes, you can respond, and we shall close this session.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Many great comments. I'm actually not sure whether I should answer, because I feel I learn a lot during your questions, because you bring up a lot of things that I'm not fully aware of or not aware of at all. The first question was very concrete and direct on the data. So my rough response is specifically to wealth and wealth distribution. I can only say that the data in the global north is also weak, and I'm ignorant so far, so I do not know much about the data sources here. And I wanted to use this summer school as an opportunity to also learn something and to get, by presentations of others and by means of comments, an impression on how the situation looks like. But I'm quite confident that these simple tools that I showed can occasionally be of help to improve the data quality when it's specifically about wealth. So I think, for example, land ownership data could be accommodated in that way. On a more general level, I think that data, so social statistics in the broadest sense have always been, or the development of modern social statistics has always been strongly intertwined with the building of state capacity. So what we see is that typically state action, either planned action, desired action, or past action, typically leads to the generation of data that then can be in a second step used for purposes of planning or for academic purposes. So I think this kind of general question of data availability is something that has to go some way, and there is a specific point to make that we need certain kinds of data to provide, to put the public sector or politicians in a position to make effective decisions. And here probably it is often the case that we have situations where we need the data first, and I would see the part of acquisition of data for such planning purposes also as a part of a development process. With regard to the more general debate on comparative advantage and dependence, I just wanted to say that I think dependence theory that was mentioned once has a lot to teach about the current situation in Africa. At the same time, it's in my view not an exhaustive explanation. So being in a dependent position does not imply that you cannot make an additional mistake on your own. So there are many sources, I think, and we have to sort of say, we should not blame just one fraction or one group in isolation. So I think it's important, and I think it's necessary to recognize that these moments of strong dependence of the African continent exist, because without recognizing it, this creates, in my view, fatalism. At the same time, you always have to be aware about where and how you can be effective by means of your own actions, or where and how do you make mistakes that probably could be corrected. So I think it's not a hard contradiction to say someone or some country or some continent is in a dependent position, and at the same time you can still be smart about what to make out of a potentially shitty situation, so to say. Going back to the dependence issues, I think the discussion showed, also in conjunction with the talk, that we have many layers of this dependence. So I'm really thankful for this great example with the organic seeds and the genetically modified seeds, because it shows how basically a new mechanism, a new anchor of sustaining such dependent relationships is introduced. We also had the very nice example from Howard about how basically intracontinental transactions in Africa strengthen the US dollar. Maybe that's a practical solution, but at the end, the argument that you also strengthen your dependency by proceeding that way is correct. And we could say what we just said about currencies, also about credits. And finally, if you look at industrial production, I mean, as far as I understood, most of the motorbikes here are from India, and maybe they are cheap, and this was a good deal at the moment. But again, then if you have this large stock of motorbikes from India, you're dependent on them in terms of technology, in terms of spare parts. And there's always, basically, in all these different spheres, we can ask the question how to break out of this. And I think, I do not think heterodox economics has all the answers or so, but it can give some guidance, at least the developing strategies. And for me, it's quite clear from this perspective that you cannot get rid of all these dependencies at once, but getting rid of some of them step by step, even if it's only baby stepwise, is in my view necessary to emancipate the continent. But generally, I'm not a development expert, and as emphasized in the beginning, I'm at least learning as much from you as you've maybe learned from me.
It's getting late, so let me just respond quickly to some, again, continuing interesting points. The issue of data, to begin with, it's always data for what? And that's been the real problem, is a lot of the upgrading in data has been done with the same model in country after country, and it's a World Bank model. They come in, they finance it, you got to do household budget surveys. Well, one of the problems, for example, with household budget surveys, if you want to see what happens with an intervention on the production side, you're not going to get that from a household budget survey that's based on consumption, revealed consumption analysis. You need to actually look at what happens, and you'll hear about how our group has developed a system of imputed income. They can actually follow what happens on the production side with an intervention. So it's always data for what purpose, which is absolutely central. Part of it is that neoclassicals think, the ultimate measurement of welfare and improvement of poverty is looking at consumption patterns. But what's absolutely crucial in the dynamics of poverty is how are you changing the nature of production? What is needed on the production side, and see what happens. I mean, it's ludicrous that you would have a measure of household budget, household welfare that doesn't include savings, doesn't include big ticket items. They're simply looking at kind of, you mark in your book your consumption habits. And they did it at country after country after country. And we've kind of contested that in a paper we're writing. So again, always the issue of statistics and data is, what are you trying to do? What do you need it for? How do you use it to evaluate, to change things? And what is the best source and usage of that data? And that's the way it should be done. And it should be done by country by country. And it gets into the broader discussion we had of where the ideas should come from. One of the issues basically is, if you talk about technology and GMOs and importing that also creates dependency and just builds up big agro companies. But again, what you need, and it happens in some countries, you need to develop your own seeds, your own indigenous technology, with good studies. It's done in some places, not nearly enough. Alternative fertilizers, but it's all about developing internal science and technology, and economic ideas that are not simply part of the broader colonial project, but actually then done for the purposes of addressing the issues in one country after the next. And it gets back to, I've had a long history of run-ins with the African Development Bank. It's always been more neoclassical, more neoliberal than the World Bank. And so how do you go to the African Development Bank to get anything done? It's not going to happen. I mean, in some senses, you have to begin to think about new organizations with new ideas, and that's part of what we do, is building up the capacity to use heterodox economics and alternative tools to come up with new policy formulations that are going to basically begin to address the dynamics of wealth inequality, and more broadly, the underlying structural transformation that's needed. Otherwise, not much of anything is going to happen. So let me just, I could go on and on, it's getting late, but sadly, and I'd say one last thing, is, there are vested interests in keeping the existing system among elites in this country, because they gain from it. They gain a lot of wealth from it. And we can never forget that, including some leadership. Leadership is all built, is basically uneven. Some leaders and some of the elites in the countries are happy with this existing system because it reproduces their wealth. You got to remember, when we have this global wealthy class, there are African participants in the global wealth and the global system that gain from it, and that are in a position entrenched to try to maintain and reproduce the system. But you hope ultimately, and I've been making this argument, for example, in Tanzania. My first job teaching as a grad student, guys, was 44 years ago, right? And we used to teach something completely different. And then the entire group of economists in Tanzania became consultants, no longer doing research for their country, but in fact doing research for the money they earn, because they made conditions difficult and all the incentives, and they got trained by the IRC, which I've written about, and picked up the tools to reproduce what the donors wanted to do, rather than doing research for their own countries. And that's what has to change in some senses. And the final point I want to make, which is really central, is when you educate, you need to be thinking about jobs for people. When you have an educational system, you shouldn't just let the market go, whoever wants to earn money in a private sector university, they'll offer whatever's available. You need to be thinking on the other side in planning education, always planning education. And the final point of that is we can learn a lot from the Germans about one of the ways you embed people in the employment system, is you basically you set up a system in which they take on jobs and training as they're getting educated. And it's really a wonderful system which has not been used enough in Africa. You want to say something?
Before we close, I wanted to emphasize again that this session was, the discussion to this session was very rich in terms of perspectives and ideas brought up. And I just wanted to urge you to maybe, so we had very many interesting ideas and details, like the genetically modified crops, or there we had a typology of different outcomes of different education models. We had the fatalism. I think there were very many interesting details that people know too little about. So my final plea for today would be that you maybe take 2 or 3 minutes to note down for yourself what are, in your view, the most important or the most illuminating or the most telling specific examples for discussing and explaining this dependency we discussed today, because these are all topics that we could basically use and return to when we move to the part where we try to produce stuff. As you all know, there is a lecture part in the summer school, but there's also a more productive part where we really try to do stuff. And the idea in this is to produce blog posts, that is basically short texts to be published on the internet. And I think there were many specific ideas and small pieces of knowledge that could be, so to say, provide a seed for such a short text, because there were many details that in my view, enhance our understanding, and which are maybe too small for a full talk, but which would be perfectly suitable for such a short text. So my plea is to think 2 or 3 minutes which detail you would like, you found you interesting for yourself, or maybe which detail you brought up that could be rolled out in a short text that is hopefully then also illuminating to somebody and reproducing the knowledge we discuss and create here. Many thanks for your effort. I took up the
Thank you all for participating actively today, for coming so early and keeping alert and active throughout the session. We would like to end today's session and ask you to go for a cup of coffee, and thereafter you leave at leisure. We see you tomorrow. Thank you once again. Coffee is ready, tea is ready there right away.
When you're heading back to the when you're heading back to the hotel, I'll go with you. When you're heading back to the hotel, I am full. Right now? But I can give 5 minutes. 5 minutes is fine. Grab a cup of coffee and then we go.